Before Christmas, Dame Esther Rantzen made headlines when she revealed that she's joined Dignitas and would consider assisted suicide if the treatment she's receiving for lung cancer doesn't work. She said she wanted to avoid what she called a bad death, but she expressed concern that any loved ones who might accompany her to Switzerland could risk prosecution. She's amongst a growing number of people calling for a reform in the legislation. Since then, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said he backs a change in the law. And former Home Office Minister Kit Malthouse said sentiment has moved significantly since 2015, the last time Parliament voted on the issue. So, could legislation on assisted dying be closer than we think? Well, joining me now is someone who would oppose a change in the law, Britain's greatest ever Paralympian Baroness Grey-Thompson. Good morning, Tani.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining us. Do you have any sympathy for Esther Rantzen's view that a trip to Dignitas would spare both her and her family pain and suffering?
I do have sympathy for Dame Esther because nobody wants a terrible death. And the reality in this country is we don't talk about death, but also there is no reason that people should have a terrible death. We should have access to specialist palliative care. And, you know, there's lots of sort of rumours and misunderstanding about things like morphine and how people's lives are ended. And pain should be controlled. So when people talk about all these cases of terrible deaths, you know, families should be complaining. They should be, you know, challenging the system to make sure that their families don't go through this. But there are really big consequences if we change the law, and our relationship between an individual and society fundamentally changes.
But I think the issue for many people here is not the technical issue of safeguards and so on, but I guess one of principle and choice. You and I have discussed this before, and I was interested, listening to the last time we talked about it on air. You said that 25 years ago you probably wouldn't have taken this position, but you've now changed your view. What made you change your position?
I think it's looking into the detail and the reality of what happens. So, you know, those who want to change the law will talk about choice. The reality is you're pushing choice to two doctors where there's no witnesses and there's no necessarily any formal sort of process of recording how that decision is made. We talk about 6 months left to live. Well, we all know that, you know, when doctors, you know, give somebody a prognosis, that is, you know, can be quite wildly out. So it's looking at the detail and looking at, you know, other jurisdictions around the world. So those who want to change the law may say that, you know, the law hasn't changed in those countries, but it's the practice that has changed. So, you know, in Canada now, if you're anorexic, you can request it. If you're diabetic, you can request it. If you're poor, you can request it. And there's a case that's garnered quite a lot of publicity. Christine Gauthier, who's a wheelchair user, she asked for funding to have a ramp to her house, and she was offered the drugs to end her life. You also look at cases like Oregon, where Oregon's a tiny US state, where, you know, 1 in 9 deaths under assisted suicide, you know, end up with complications. They're on their 4th set of drugs in 8 years with no research into patient protocols. The thing that really worries me with places like Oregon is that they destroy all the source documents a year after the patient's died. So there's already, you know, not great recording of evidence between a patient and a doctor. But if those source documents are destroyed, you can't go back and check whether someone has made a genuine decision to end their lives. And the other issue is, you know, will we invest enough money in making sure that people have made that genuine choice?
Can I come back? Well, can I come back to that issue of choice? I take all your points about the process and, you know, there's no good outcome here, actually. But you've always been a great champion of the rights of disabled people, and you and I have, in a way, been on platforms and been on, if you like, on the same campaigns and so on. At the heart of what you've always said is that a person with a disability needs to have reasonable adjustments to give them the same set of options and choices as a person without a disability. I've always been curious about this. Why is it that when it comes to the single most important choice that an individual might make, are you so set against giving somebody who is disabled that choice?
And that is a really difficult one. Genuine choice in our lives is really hard to come by. And a choice to live is one thing. But we've got to be really careful of coercive control. You know, we passed legislation on that recently. We can't just assume that coercive control only happens in certain parts of everyone's life. And, you know, in the week where the government has said they're not going to put any mitigation into place for disabled people who need life-saving equipment at home, like ventilators, if there's a sudden power cut, you know, disabled people will have that choice stripped away. And, you know, there is no organisation of or for disabled people who is supportive of a law change. Yes, there are individual disabled people who support it, but we all have different levels of choice. And I'm really worried that disabled people, because of the cost of health and social care, because that's been removed, that choice is then taken away. So the only choice they have is to end their lives. If you need personal care and all you get is 15 minutes a day and you have to choose whether you eat or you go to the bathroom, that is not choice in people's lives.
All right. Can I just ask you lastly one other question, which is not about the person themselves, but those who are around them. And I think you'll understand why I'm asking you this question. You and I have both been in a place where we've had to watch a loved one die in extreme pain and suffering and so on. The one thing that you know in that situation is that if that person passes away while you're in the room, you immediately become a murder suspect, subject to investigation. Is that really the way we want the law to work?
No, and I think when Keir Starmer was in Public Prosecution Office, in terms of the clarification he provided on that was very useful. But actually, we also just have to recognise that, you know, where there's a will, there's a relative. And we have to make sure that people are protected. So, you know, personally, I think the law is fine where it is. We should debate it. We should keep debating it. But people also really need to understand the consequences of a law change. It's not simple in terms of how people end their lives. And the consequences for people who don't have choice are really severe.
Tanni, thank you so much for spending time. I'm sure that we're going to be talking about this again and again.